I think I mean the main thing about transport is we're still stuck in this whole paradigm of widening roads and building metro rail, doing sort of very capital intensive infrastructure, whereas sort of globally slowly the acceptance of this paradigm is over. I mean, I think what we need is a city where we move people and not vehicles, and I think this sort of large level paradigm change we need to make sure becomes commonplace. Now there are ways of doing it. One of the ways is to build the communication around this, and then the second is to do sort of good pilot projects that actually demonstrate the alternatives. And what JNURM did was essentially created some of these pilots. So one important thing in the next few years is to document the results that come out of the pilots, so that that story gets communicated correctly, and so there is an evidence of why people need to move away. So that to me is an important, and Ahmedabad, Indore, these are some sort of leaders in that. So I think that story needs to be communicated, of Bangalore and in the BMTC system. I think those stories have to be communicated with a data driven approach. So that's one thing. um, uh, then I think more sort of initiatives or projects like this need to be supported, and so that to me is a sort of big piece. Then the other thing is transport traditionally in India has been a public sector service, but I think more and more we are saying that the private sector needs to be made a player to participate both in the providing all of the assets like the buses and the the roads that are urban roads and not highways. So the private sector to provide all of the technology solutions, so the private sector needs is missing. So there has to be some incentives to create this private sector, and and then sort of also on the operation side, private operators, etc. So I think this whole private sector ecosystem has to be developed, because I think otherwise we will struggle to actually support a large scale up in some of these pilot ideas that we have developed. And like I said, going back to the bigger problem of sort of the paradigm shift, I think these campaign based approaches have really worked. I think this whole Rahagiri and what it has done, I mean how quickly it has spread, and suddenly it has changed the imagination for people across the country. And at least that it's made it possible to have that conversation that you can have a city without cars, and look, this is what a city with cars feels like, looks like. And I think that to me, and that's a one campaign, but I think with the issue of air pollution rising, I think the public health aspect that people don't understand, but the linkage between sort of not getting physical activity, doing sort of walking and things like that, has a huge impact on. So it's no longer that I can afford a car. You can afford a car, but if you afford a car, then you also have to afford doing treadmill for an hour or hospital bills. I mean and if you don't want to do either, then you really have to really reduce the consumption of the car. I mean, I think this message, so campaign based approaches to sort of drive the big messages, then really supporting, creating more good best practices, and then documenting the evidence around best practices, and then really finding a way to enable a private sector that will be able to allow the rapid ramp up of these solution sets that we are talking about. So I think this to me is the what we need to make happen in the next 5 years. So I think typically what we are saying is, when we say you don't want to build flyovers and things, I mean what we are saying is, for a city, one of the first things we talk about is that cities don't need wide roads. I mean there was a talk about making cities accessible to 8-year-olds and 80-year-olds, these 880 cities as they are called. I mean how do we build 880 cities? And one of fundamental we are saying is urban roads have to be built on what we call the 40-40 principle. So they shouldn't be wider than 40 meters, and they shouldn't be faster than 40 kilometers an hour. So the 40-40 principle is a very, I mean it's so if you build your urban road systems using this principle, then you ensure two things. One, you ensure universal access, because the big challenge is actually crossing the road. And then you design, you put all of the little elements that actually make it accessible. It's the speed humps, the bollards, the level footpath, and all of that. So and 40 is other, again 40 kilometers an hour is important, because it's, if accidents below 40 kilometers an hour, your likelihood probability of death is less than 70 or 80%, whereas above 40 kilometers it increases by 80%. So it's a big change. So from the, then how do you, then the whole question is how do you accommodate all these people in 40-meter wide roads? This is where bus rapid transit actually becomes a solution. So with bus rapid transit you can essentially move 3 times the people in one lane in the same facility. So it's how you increase capacity without widening your road. And and so the examples of Ahmedabad and Indore where bus rapid transit has been implemented, I think is extremely powerful, and are good instances how you can increase capacity to move people and not move vehicles on this. And then the third sort of big piece around this is, so you follow the 40-40 principle, you design for universal access, which is and then you, so that sort of solves. And then sort of then you augment the bus rapid transit on the big arterials with the bus system, which is so buses for mass transit and using technology to sort of make that happen is sort of the second thing. The third thing is integration that we talk about. Again, I think this is one of the best times in the world to do integration. One, because we talk about integration 3 ways: fare integration, schedule integration, and physical integration. So for fare integration, I think the MOUD in partnership with National Payments Corporation is coming out with new standards, and so all the banks are very interested. So so in Kochi Metro and BMTC are some examples. So you will soon see open access fare cards that you can use on any mode. That will enable sort of fare integration. Schedule integration by opening up your data. So open data, almost everybody is tracking their vehicles. So opening up the data and letting people sort of build all of the apps and things again. So fare integration, schedule integration is very simple. The third big challenge is physical integration. Problem with physical integration is actually land to build your bus depots and terminals. Hardest thing to find in the cities. And so that's one of the things where planners need to be proactive and see how they can capture land. And this has been one of the bigger challenges in many cities, even including Indore, where we did a lot of work. Is there is not, if you buy buses, there's no place to park them. And so this, and in Delhi, that's the same battle that is going on. Bangalore is actually one of the few places that is very clever and actually banked a lot of land for bus depots and terminals for the future. So this so to me these are the big things, right? I mean, so you do, you follow the 40-40 principle, you make buses mass transport, you do integration. And then the next thing is around transit oriented development, which is trying to do land development around transit. Again, Delhi is a great example of how they've actually got a TOD policy notified now they have to develop the details, but I think other cities need to follow suit and see how they can notify these TOD policies. And the final thing is what we are now beginning to call shared mobility, which is you're all the way from your rickshaws to your taxis to anything which are shared vehicles or for hire vehicles, which essentially multiple people are using the same vehicle. And cycles can be shared vehicles, cycle rickshaws can be shared vehicles, all the way to buses. So there's a whole, it is vehicle agnostic, but how can you use technology to be able to facilitate multiple people to use the same assets in a much more cost. And I mean, I think the private sector is, this is where the innovation has really taken off. And I think the government, really the role the government needs to play is actually to, what we're saying, develop management frameworks and not regulatory frameworks. So danda nahi marna hai, management, we need basically management frameworks, much more sort of performance based systems, and things like that. So that I think this is a sort of comprehensive story. And there's various examples, like I said, Chennai has done some really nice things on sidewalks. Bangalore has the tender show project. Attempts in Delhi are being made, so it's all there. Buses, we've seen very good examples. Multimodal integration, we're beginning to see things. TOD, so it's all there, the pilots are there. We just need to find a way to make sure all of that happens in one city, and then that all cities are sort of moving along this path. And the PWD minister in Delhi now has sent a great message by saying that we will not build any more flyovers. I think that's a great starting point. I think that's one thing that every city needs to do, say we will stop building flyovers. And I think that to me is a sort of a great sort of precedence again that other cities need to pick up on. And I think that these are sort of advantages of having a AAP like government getting elected. So so that will be an issue, I think, always, because what you want to make sure. So one, what you want, I mean, what you want to make sure is at least people who live in these transit oriented development communities don't use cars. right? They use transit, there is value. I mean, the worst thing to happen is they actually live in the TOD zones, drive up the prices, and then still use their cars. I mean, then one way to do it is to put very strict parking regulations, right? The other thing is to build some affordable housing into these facilities, and it's not been easy. Even the best places in the world haven't managed to do it, so it's a challenge and it's a recognized challenge. But building smaller units, reducing unit size, etc., are ways. Again, developers always don't see the margins in building the smaller units, etc., so those issues will come up. So you will have to find clever ways, push, force certain things to happen. But some of it will happen, and I think in the sort of slightly more global picture, I think you have to sort of take it, because it still will create positive benefits for everyone in the city. So again, there is no sort of silver bullet on this. I mean, it will create gentrification and things like that, but it is anyway happening. I mean, it's also happening. There is unsustainable gentrification. Let's make it a little more sustainable. I mean, I think so. That's a bit of the story. So vending, I think I think again it's a battle versus vending and parking, right? So both so I think street vending has to stay. There are cleverer ways of doing it. We need to I mean, I think you can reduce the point of sale space, you can try to create community kitchen locations. So I think vending has to be encouraged, because it actually adds security and things like that to streets. So vending has to be encouraged. There's enough evidence that vending that there is no oversupply in vending also, right? That gets managed as self-regulated. So I think creating the spaces, and again sort of making sure you do much more cleverer sort of management of the vendors. I think you can I think there are very creative ways of solving this problem. So I think recognizing it, doing the data uh, gathering for this, and then thinking out of the box to come up with sort of solutions. But I think that to me is a solvable problem, that we need to just say that it's a problem and solve it. Right? I mean, that's the so yeah. Yeah, again, I think so. These campaign-based approaches are good. I think it's not just communication of mass transit. I mean, it's a communication of this whole sort of how transport facilities. We have the solutions. We're not. It's not rocket science. Cycles will solve your problem. Walking will solve a problem. So, solutions are there. I think people need to convince that these are solutions. That you don't need flying cars, and so I think that communication has to go. And then there is a communication at the project level, right? Saying we've done this facility. You'll be surprised to know that every single bus company in India probably has a 50 crore budget to do measures for women's security. uh, Nobody knows what those programs are. They are never communicated. So I think that's a level of communication that needs to happen, which is what are your programs, how do you serve it, what are your routes, so improving and sort of so one is sort of this sort of high level communication, the other is program level communication that needs to be established to talk about service. So I think there is significant improvement is required in both cases, and I think will be a very key thing as we go forward, and how do we build the messaging around these ideas.